Are you tired of the usual harem feel-good and episodic conflict resolution style romance anime? Are you craving something genuine and, dare I say, real? If that is the case, then you are in the right place, because today we are talking about another top 10 romance anime in my book that doesn't exactly have a perfect fairy tale ending, nor a central theme that's so upbeat it could make Ayana Koji crack a smile. Ladies and gentlemen, grab yourselves a glass of fruit punch and some media eats and get ready to either be put onto peak or relive it once again. On today's menu, we have Welcome to the NHK. This show is different from most romance anime because it follows the bent and broken personalities of a strong cast of main and side characters that are so layered, it's impressive that the studio could flesh them all out across a span of only 24 episodes. This anime is based on a manga that was based on a novel by Tatsuhiko Takimoto and animated by Studio Gonzo, which gave us the likes of Full Metal Panic, Afro Samurai, and The Last Exile. Finding a good English dub from early on in the 2000s is extremely hard, but the cast of this show does a great job conveying pain, sadness, comedy, and confusion, so much so that I would highly recommend it for any potential watchers. The most recent shows either gloss over otaku shut-in behaviors, make them somehow jokingly comedic circumstances, or flat out glorify them. But this show that aired way back in 2004 goes a little bit against the grain. One could say it even paints a little too much of a vicious reality at times. This show is about a hopeless shut-in that perchancebly comes into contact with a pretty young girl that wants to play his guardian angel while rehabilitating him and preparing him to re-enter society. But of course, it couldn't be that simple, or else it wouldn't have a seat anywhere near my top 10. So let me break down exactly why this show is not only a great watch, but also is definitely a show worth losing sleep over. The show follows characters refusing to take charge of their own situations and circumstances, and instead blaming conspiracies and others around them in order to diffuse the blame, while also using said people to support them in the same way that a life jacket works on a person that has fallen overboard in the middle of the open sea. You cannot escape the feelings that are woven into the show, and one could even say that the depression is more of a central point than the sneaky romance that weaves its way into our hearts as the story goes on. Many shows portray the hero and MC fighting against insurmountable odds and finding some incredible and complicated method that allows them to prevail to the greatest heights possible. But in Welcome to the NHK, we are fed a more realistic storyline that can be minimized by saying life can suck, and it can even wear you out to the point of near total loss and fatigue. But as long as you try to better yourself and your situation even a teeny tiny bit, you may just be able to carve out an existence worth living. Granted, this show shows us that even the little reprieves from life's grievances can be few and far in between. However, sometimes the little things in life are enough to compel a common everyday person into hanging in there just a little bit longer. I should preface that I did watch this show early on in my anime enjoyment journey, and honestly, I may have been a touch too young to really grasp how wickedly concerning and dark certain plot points could be. The use of interesting medications, improper treatment of those around the characters, and even tossing around the idea of terminating several characters' subscriptions to life and existence were all more than fair game. But it is in part because of all these circumstances that this show sticks to the front of my brain and the brains of others so easily. Sato is our MC that is a 22-year-old university dropout who also has parents that move heaven and earth just to send him money to survive on. I realized that in a lot of anime, the main characters have a tendency to stay in an apartment away from their parents, and the parents fund their entire lifestyle all the same. I used to think it was bizarre, but considering how simple it is to sustain a guy in the high school to early 20s age range, it makes a whole lot more sense. The heavens know, if I were to visit one of my college buddies' apartments right now that live alone or with roommates, I'd be lucky to see more than one set of silverware, a couch instead of lawn chairs, and an actual stand underneath the television instead of a cardboard box or the bare floor. Sato is a hikikomori that rarely ventures outside of the confines of his apartment building unless necessities demanded of him. He opens the door for solicitors one day in particular and comes into contact with a tag-along that we come to know as Misaki. He has lived the majority of his young adult life in fear of the outside world and blames the NHK for all the unfortunate happenings that he comes across. The NHK is an organization that doesn't even exist in the world of the anime, and he cooked it up so that he can avoid accountability for anything that goes on around him. It manifests across the anime in some of the most hilarious and creative ways, whether it be a Sato daydream about talking appliances, little blue creatures snickering and causing mischief, or voices in his head and words taking up the majority of the scene in a moment of him panicking. Now, this all started back in high school when he was in a club with his senpai and she first peddled the idea across his brain. He has a short arc with her during the run of the anime, but we will vaguely discuss that later. As sad of an angle as it is to take on why life occurs as it does around you, I can't entirely blame him because she was the first real love interest of his, and the only thing more whimsically goofy and out of sorts than a man in love is a high school boy in love. It honestly was a great show for me because it was genuinely sad to see how down and out he could be at times and how dire he allowed his situation to become, but at the same time it was hilarious to see him tweaking out in the most random of times, especially when the overthinking started to hit. Misaki was able to get him to sign a contract that would force him to come to the park each night at a specific time to undergo experimental rehabilitation, which really was just her trying to make him entirely dependent on her so she could keep living because he was the only person she had come across that was worse off than herself. We have the best friend and neighbor of Sato being Yamazaki, and while he may come across as your usual useless, goofy gag character, he actually offers some interesting perspective and even manages to show us what a more socially capable and less emotionally shattered version of Sato actually looks like. He lies both at university and away from it, but manages to somehow sift through it all to keep himself together and come across as a cool know-it-all with a great deal of computer skills to Sato, who also inevitably kind of gets used for his programming knowledge when Sato lies and tells Misaki that he has a job as a top software developer for video games. But let's not harp on that too much. In the same vein, Sato lying in the show is a genuinely interesting thing to watch because previous to becoming an adult, it was said that he never lied, not because of something noble and oppressive, but instead simply because he was always scared due to him not wanting to make his mother ashamed of him. He repetitively lies to his neighbor Yamazaki, lies to Misaki as well about being busy all the time and being a video game creator, and even wiggles his way into going onto an abandoned island with the senpai from high school that greatly influenced his thought patterns. As the show goes on, we see how far he's willing to go in order to keep up the lies, and also how far he's willing to push himself in order to survive. Most importantly and obviously when he actually has to get a job to get paid because his parents cut him off from their wallets because they quite literally had no more funds to give him. That was another interesting corner of the show that can be easily forgotten because of all the other craziness involved, but Sato literally used his parents for every dollar that they could send him with no feelings of remorse or sadness even when his mom called to tell him how shaky things were getting on their end. For people similar to Sato, the most important thing tends to be their lack of willingness to actually do what's required of them until all else fails and they find that nobody is coming to save them. It's an honest truth for even more people than we realize in our own personal lives. Seeing his growth, particularly alongside Misaki, makes this show really interesting, but also manages to convey the importance of being willing to stand through a storm on your own 2 feet and aim for a brighter tomorrow, regardless of its likelihood of happening or lack thereof. Now it's time to give more attention to the other half of our twisted romantical pairing, Misaki. She comes across as some random girl that just really wants to help our MC Sato just because it's the right thing to do. But as the series wears on, we see that she really does it because she views him as a sorrier and lesser version of herself. So in her mind, if she can convince the one person whose life may be worth less than hers to stay with her and remain dependent on her, then she won't be alone ever again, and she will always have somebody to rely on. How did she get his information and easily manipulate him, you may ask? Well, she stays in a big house on a hill that gives her the perfect viewing angle into his apartment window, and her family members actually own the apartment complex that he stays in. What a coincidence! So as a result, that would mean that she also has the entire file to the life of the man that is Sato. She makes things really heavy at one point, and it really struck a chord in the heart of my previous teenage mind, which was re-triggered when rewatching the show for this review. Without going into too much detail, I am the oldest boy in a large family. Because of this, I was often the third parent of the house that filled in when my parents were out. However, it led to me lacking a sense of self because every thought that I formulated and every action that I took was always with the intent of looking good in front of my parents or setting the example for my younger siblings. I would even go as far as to say that I hated myself during the majority of my teenage years. Every time I looked in the mirror, I just saw a toy soldier that wound itself up each day to make sure the prescribed tasks were completed, and then I would be able to shut back down. The scene that made me recall this time in particular was an episode where Misaki details her relationship with a cat that she feeds at the park that her and Sato frequent. She tells Sato that she has nearly an entirely fake relationship with the stray because it only plays nice and warms up to her due to it understanding that she will bring it food. From this though, she recognizes that if she were to stop bringing food for the cat, then it would simply leave in search of another person to feed it. A part of the circumstances that really resonated with me was when she told Sato that she saw nothing wrong with her relationship with the cat and that it only makes sense that it would leave when she has nothing left to offer it any longer. To me, I always recognized that people being around me by choice only occurred when I had something of use to them at my disposal. Similarly, if I could acquire a skill or commit to doing a task for the person, then I could remain in their good graces as well. So in a way, it was a method used to cope with not wanting to be alone and hoping that somebody would eventually deem me useful enough to keep around permanently. In essence, one could say I was looking for my very own Misaki. She didn't have to be perfect, or honestly much better off than me. I just wanted somebody to recognize the toy soldier that I was and choose to wind me up and use me of their own accord until I completely fell apart. And maybe, just maybe, if I was lucky enough to really put on a great show of my abilities, they would still want me around when I had nothing to offer. Sorry about that, ladies and gents. I got a little bit too serious and heavy right there. It's a little bit uncharacteristic of me. But yeah, basically, I wish that somebody would invest in me and want me around the same way that Misaki wanted Sato to never leave her side. Despite roughly a decade having passed since watching the show originally as a teenager, not much has changed now that I think about it. Any Misakis out there watching this video, tap in. My IG, Twitter, and Discord are in the description. I'm 6'4", anywhere from a 6 to an 8.7 on my face card, haircut dependent of course. I can cook, I can clean, I work hard, and I'm extremely empathetic. And for any guys that felt me a little bit too much during my little personal rant, y'all add me too. And of course, like the video and subscribe to the channel if you think I've done a good job so far. But back to the devious angel Misaki. She pretended to want to rehabilitate Sato just to make him so dependent on her that he would always seek out her presence, which really had her channeling her inner Aizen. She eventually planned on having him sign a second contract that would say his life belonged to her, which would mean she finally has a person that could make her feel like she wasn't the most worthless human being, and also by being in a relationship with that one person that she deemed to be more hopeless than herself, it would solve her biggest problem. Is this love story a bit toxic? Yes. Was it oddly satisfying and realistic? Also yes. Every twist and turn made things even more puzzling than at any other point, but somehow the fog cleared and things all fell into place in the end, more or less. This is best seen when Sato foolishly agrees to go to an abandoned island with Kitome, his old senpai, and a group of her friends, if you can call them that. He didn't know that it was actually to relieve themselves of the need to consume oxygen permanently, but he sure found out when they reached the top of the rocky cliff and prepared to jump. Now, Kitome is arguably the most normally self-destructive person in the storyline because she's a regular girl that isn't socially awkward like Kawasaki and Sato and simply feels like her life isn't really worth anything. Her boyfriend cares about her but always has to focus on work. She doesn't enjoy working at her own job, and she's constantly left alone, which only was resolved when she was with Sato about to make the jump that she would not return from, and her boyfriend proposed to her over a loudspeaker on a boat in the waters below. It was an extreme act of love, but at the same time, it gave her the one thing that she really needed in that moment in time, which was the feeling and sense of belonging and security and understanding that somebody does value her life even greater than she ever could. So much so that they would give themselves in order to have her for the rest of their life. This was an interesting scene because we, as third-person onlookers, would expect Sato to try and talk everybody down from jumping, but that would go against how he views himself as a character. Instead, he speaks and empowers them into wanting to jump even more until one by one, they all chicken out. Not because they weren't sad or in pain, but instead because of the potential emotional scars and anguish that would inevitably befall their closest friends and family when they found out. Where does Misaki fit into all of this? Great job asking questions. She rides in on another boat alongside Kitome's fiance and Yamazaki and gets on the boat speaker system to give a weird and easily misconstrued speech about how absolutely useless and worthless Sato is. That not only is he both of those things, but he is the most useless and the most worthless person that she's ever come across. But it is because of how completely useless and worthless that he is that makes her need him. Like, it's a weird way to say you love me and don't want me to log out of the game forever, but cool, I guess? This is where the easily misconstrued part comes into frame, because her saying that with a specific delivery and word choice literally made him want to jump even more, because she is arguably the most important person in his life up until that point. But she literally thinks that he's useless and worthless, but not even just regular useless, like dirty gum at the bottom of some Jordans that have been beaten and creased to death kind of useless and worthless. We realized that if she really wasn't trying to be selfish, she would have said something more compassionate that would have made him back up. But by basically saying, I need you to keep living so that I have a reason not to hate myself, just put a spotlight on her flaws and selfishness as a person. Spoiler for those that haven't seen, he obviously didn't end up kicking the can. This led to a few more adventures in a scene where she is attempting to silently off-screen herself, but Sato stepped up to the plate and traveled a great distance along trains and roads just so that he could save her from herself, which in turn led to, of course, the canceling of the previously aforementioned second contract that would have had Sato being essentially owned by Misaki, and instead it was restructured to make it so that he wouldn't just belong to her, but instead she and he would mutually try to get better as people for the sake of trying, despite there being no guarantee of their success at the end of it all. The characters agreeing to try and the show ending a bit open-ended instead of it being sunshine and rainbows really made it more realistic in my eyes, because in real life there are no guarantees about happiness. It's just those that try to make something happen and those that give up and diffuse the accountability onto others so that they can protect themselves from their own mental anguish. The only character that I felt had an actually rough ending was Kobayashi, who had gotten into a boatload of debt when trying to use a pyramid scheme to take care of her brother, who was a more aggressive and deplorable version of the shut-in that Sato was. She used her previous high school connection to Sato in order to sign him up and offload her problems onto him, only for it to ultimately backfire and her essentially watching her world crumble around her as the scheme became too much. Her irritating brother even got off better than her, because when she stopped returning home and he realized that she wasn't going to wait on him hand and foot and give him food anymore, he elected to get off his butt and get a job himself. The only other character that I didn't harp on heavily but deserves some shine would definitely be Yamazaki, the neighbor slash best friend of Sato, who constantly redirected the listless Sato into locking in and creating the script for their gal game that actually ended up turning into something that I would have been willing to test out myself if it actually existed, even though they were unsuccessful in selling it at the convention that they went to, which ultimately led to Yamanashi having to go back home and work as a farmer on his parents' farm. Yes, he may have been running away from his responsibilities of taking over his family business back home, and he may not have been the greatest at being social at university, and he may have been a tad bit too two-dimensionally obsessed, but even he found a great deal of peace and enjoyment in life when he eventually was forced to return home and take over the same family business that he originally wanted nothing to do with. We even see him actually getting married to a girl that looks great in photos with him, and even starts a family while tending to his responsibilities as a business leader for the family, even though it had nothing to do with his initial love for creating video games. If you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you. Let me know about your thoughts in the comments below. If you've seen Welcome to the NHK, tell me how your watch was, and if this spurred you into a rewatch, tell me how the rewatch went, and if you resonated with Sato, Misaki, or any of the other characters in the show as well. Go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on post notifications, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.